It's undeniably true that in the last decades the empirical sciences they discovered a lot of new findings about how the brain works, how the different areas within the brain, how they interact. However, it would be a false conclusion to assume that from this empirical research about the brain that one can also deduce or can make the inference that we are just a bunch of neurons, as you were just saying. I would say we have to distinguish between two levels. On the one hand, we have empirical research about the brain functions, and of course this research is very interesting, it's very fascinating because it tells us what has to be true, what has to be the case, what systems of the brain have to work properly so that we are able to perceive, to cognize, to rationalize, to act. From this view, like how the brain works, however, it's still a far way to claim that we are identical with the brain. So it's one thing to say the brain is necessary, it's a necessary material precondition for our proper functioning as a human person, but it's still another claim, and it's a much stronger claim to say that we are identical with our brain. In order to establish this brain, you would have to show that, well, all what the human person is about is at the end just reducible to certain brain functions, and that's a very, very strong metaphysical claim. It's for certain true that the brain is a very complex system. It's very fascinating to know how the brain works. However, one should not forget that the brain is just one organ of the human being, and there are many other organs, there are many other bodily functions which are also very interesting. And so if someone knows how the brain works, then of course, or it's probably too much to know that one person knows everything about the brain, but just if someone knows how certain parts of the brain, certain functions of the brain works, then of course such a person knows a lot. But one should also remember that research in the last decades has shown that an isolated view on the brain might not be sufficient, might not be appropriate for properly understanding even how brain functions work. So for a long time, the view was that everything that has to do with cognition, with perception, it's basically related just to the brain. So if you take perception, for instance, then of course you need a visual apparatus, you need the eyes, but these are more like the lenses that let the information in, but then the brain has to do all the work. And recent research has shown that the brain together with the body, only if you look at the brain together with the body, then you understand in a proper and adequate way how the brain itself works. So it seems that in order to understand only how the brain works, you have to focus also on other bodily systems and how the brain is embedded within the entire human organism. So there's, for instance, a recent movement called embodied cognition, and proponents of this movement, they would say, well, in order to understand how we perceive, how we cognize, we have to take into consideration not just brain functions, but also how the brain is embedded within the organism, plus the environment in which the organism finds itself. So this would be like one answer, that if someone knows the brain, then this person knows a lot, but still there's much more to be known, and even for knowing the brain, more has to be known than just things about the brain. And there's a second important aspect, I think, which should also be underlined. The human being is not just an organism. It's a social being, it's a political being, it's an ethical being. So these are other very important dimensions of the human person, of our existence, and these are dimensions that cannot be explicated in terms of brain functions. If I'm asking myself about some ethical issues, if I'm trying to solve an ethical problem, then it doesn't help if someone tells me what's going on in the brain, which brain areas are working right now when I'm making this ethical decision making. So that's like a second point which has to be mentioned. We are not just organisms, and therefore a purely organistic or a purely perspective of the human person from the point of view of biology or the brain sciences or other natural sciences would not be enough for really understanding the overall like multi-dimensionality of the human existence.